Hanna-Barbera has given us some unforgettable cartoons. Scooby-Doo, the Flintstones, you name it. They kept surprising us with every new show, and honestly, Flintstones even helped pave the way for stuff like The Simpsons and Family Guy. But there's one character that often gets overlooked, or only remembered in a totally different way, and that's Space Ghost. No, we're not talking about the sarcastic late-night host version. We're talking about the original 60s superhero flying through galaxies and fighting villains. Same name, completely different vibe. Let's check out some of the coolest facts about Space Ghost that'll make you see him in a whole new light.
Eu tentarei outra vez, mais perto.
HB cartooning history and some major firsts. Hanna and Barbera pretty much built cartoon history as we know it. Seriously, from the 50s onward, they kept dropping banger after banger. However, in 1966, when the studio was sold to Taft Broadcasting, it seemed as though they needed something original, something that could grab attention instead of sticking to the trope of funny animal comedies. Their biggest hits at that time included the Yogi Bear Show and the Huckleberry Hound Show, which mostly shared a similar format. So, Fred Silverman, a fan of the rise of the Superman phenomenon, wanted something original that could also have a similar impact but was associated with the major space travel interest that had been developing around the time. This show could be part of the Saturday lineup, which would be called the Superhero Morning, a broader initiative featuring interesting titles under the banner. So, they created Space Ghost, a space-traveling superhero with a horde of villains and his sidekicks, Jan and Jace. This ended up being the first action cartoon since 1964's Johnny Quest, and also the first Saturday morning cartoon that was entirely produced and created by Hanna-Barbera. Another major first was that this series became the first of its kind from Hanna-Barbera to premiere on CBS. If that wasn't enough, this show became the very first of the cartoons for World Vision Enterprises after Great American Broadcasting was sold in the 1960s. Yeah, the very first entry in the Great American Broadcasting era. Secret identity. One of the most crucial details about any superhero is their secret identity, which entirely changes the perspective people can have on the character. There are times when their secret identity or alter ego ends up becoming something that defines who they are as a human being apart from their superior elements, as if it's a critique of what they witness in the humanity that surrounds them. Batman's got Bruce Wayne and Spider-Man has Peter Parker. Meanwhile, Superman, also known as Kal-El, is the secret identity of a Daily Planet reporter named Clark Kent. It's quite obvious that the secret identity is crucial in defining the superhero and the various aspects associated with them, rather than making the character a one-dimensional superior being. Even though some have that formula, they aren't as popular as the secret identity ones. Back in 1966, when Space Ghost first appeared, he had no backstory or civilian identity that would be crucial to the narrative. Instead, none of the members of Space Ghost's team would take off their masks, a common practice followed by most such characters. It was only later, in the extended arcs of the character across various other media formats, that we received our origin story. It's an interesting choice to completely skip the secret identity during the original run for the character, forcing us to latch onto other details instead of focusing on one of those elements that's usually put in the opening theme.
We're out, but it's still freezing.
And there's the reason.
The Batman inspiration. Oh yeah, talking about Batman, and I mean, come on, when are we not talking about Batman? Space Ghost was originally intended to be based on a pitch that featured two pieces of art, one depicting a maskless man with two blonde children wearing blue and white space uniforms. It was only later that Toth decided to incorporate some Batman influence, which is clearly visible in the character. According to him, Freddie Silverman came in banging all kinds of ideas. We had locked down on Space Ghost, but the question of the costume was still up in the air. So there we were on Monday morning in Joe Barbera's office, and in his hands and on the cover is Adam West and the kid Burt Ward as Batman and Robin. He throws the magazine down at Joe's desk and says, "That's the look I want. I want the Batman look." I said, well, he's supposed to be Space Ghost. He should be white, you know? So finally, Space Ghost wound up with that black cowl over his head. Superpowers galore. We might not have included some of the crazier elements that explain the origins and powers of this galactic superhero. Still, it's rather interesting to see that when it comes to Space Ghost's powers, there isn't much that's missing. The character's origin introduces him as Thaddeus Black, a member of the Eidolon Elite, the intergalactic police force. However, Thaddeus had to follow some questionable orders from his superiors, who were known for running an underground criminal organization. His involvement in the operation led to a huge impact in his life because he lost his pregnant wife and was himself himself left for dead on a version of Earth that had by then become a ghost planet. It was here that he met Salomon, an old hermit who was also a weapons expert and the man who equipped Thaddeus with the weapons and the ship. So even though it isn't something that was clarified much during the original 1966 run, it always felt as if most of his powers came from the suit and the gear that he used to hang around it, along with the power bands on his wrists. The latter takes on the characters actually make things a lot clearer, and we got the answers that we needed. Now, we know that Space Ghost is capable of flight and can survive in both space and underwater. Additionally, he has a protective force field he can surround himself with, making him completely invisible. The man could end up firing a penetration beam from his eyes after harnessing electromagnetic energy and then shoot various rays using his armband, including stun, freeze, and even hypnosis rays. Apart from that, he could also manipulate time thanks to his super speed and the ability to create time warps, which reduce time travel by allowing him to teleport after transforming into pure thought and energy. Borrowing from family. Back then, action cartoons were quite limited, and not many dared to venture into that style of animation. However, it wasn't until later that the genre gained success, and people developed innovative ideas that fit perfectly within. However, the fact that this was a genre that required some unconventional animation styles often led to interesting elements that might be perceived as borrowing by fans. However, reusing certain animated sequences that have already been animated is not a new practice, as it actually makes the animation process much more cost-effective. Disney and Michael Bay do it all the time, and it actually doesn't gather as much attention as we might have raised based on the mere mention of this. Fans of Hanna-Barbera cartoons can identify these elements present in their cartoons, but they only pop out when you bring them to light in such a manner. In the case of Space Ghost, the opening credits did manage to establish very clearly the vast galaxy that our superhero friend has decided to protect. However, believe it or not, there's a major thanks owed to the Jetsons for that, who are responsible for the first shot of the Starfield effect that was borrowed and used in the cartoon.
Over there behind it, a flare.
And another flare!
That's Jace's I'm okay.
Supervillain nomenclature. A superhero is as important as the supervillain that bothers him. In the case of Space Ghost, the character had a group of characters that helped establish his ultimate superiority. Back then, supervillains were given some of the most iconic names. Names that stood out and were etched into our minds long after the show had ended. Marvel fans may recognize some of these villains' names and wonder if they've heard them before. Some of the most common names in Space Ghost's roster included the likes of Zorak, Brak and his brother Sisto, the Black Widow, Moltar, the Creature King, and even Metalis. Now, don't be shocked if you were aware of completely different names, because each of these villains underwent some major changes and developments over the course of the show, with some of them even undergoing some major pronunciation changes right in the middle of an episode. That's like some Rick and Morty levels of improv humor right there, but it's still not clear to us if it was intentional or not. But the most obvious among these was that Brak's name, which varied between a short A in the middle and a brief O in the middle at some point during the show's run. Even Moltar was called Moltor with an O instead of an A, and the character alternated with both these names in the same episode. And then, there was the one that almost felt like a gut punch to Iron Man, who had nothing to do with the series, yet the character Black Widow ended up being called Spider-Woman during all of her subsequent appearances in the show. Yikes. At least Space Ghost remains Space Ghost. You can't not talk about Dino Boy. Space Ghost's run consisted of two completely unrelated segments, one of which was Space Ghost itself, and the other was Dino Boy in the Lost Valley. In fact, there have been times when the show itself was called Space Ghost and Dino Boy to group them together. Unlike Space Ghost, Dino Boy followed the adventures of a boy named Todd, who ended up parachuting out of a crashing plane and landing in an unknown South American valley filled with prehistoric mammals, including dinosaurs and even cavemen. Apart from that, there were some interesting tribes and strange creatures that appeared in the show, including moss men, worm people, and even vampire men. Dino Boy isn't alone as he deals with these beings and the tribes, teaming up with a caveman named Ugg, a sigh of relief, along with his pet baby Brontosaurus, Bronte, and an occasional appearance from a woolly mammoth called Tusco. Fun fact, the character of Todd was voiced by Johnny Carson, but not the talk show host. In fact, Johnny Carson had to change his voice because of the popularity of the talk show host. Sticking to the routine of the shows, though, even Dino Boy didn't get a proper backstory, except for the short sequence in the opening that showed him arriving at the Lost Valley via his parachute. Even the name Todd isn't really clarified, except for some people referring to him by that name throughout the series. Even though both shows had a subsequent run, there was no segment for Dino Boy during episodes 19 and 20 of Space Ghost, as those episodes featured the 6-part Council of Doom arc from Space Ghost. Legacy. One of the biggest indications that the show had been a success was that it was released on multiple formats in the 80s, and certain episodes were particularly selected for VHS runs, including Zorak, the Heat Thing, and obviously the Creature King. However, that's not where the legacy of the show ended, because Space Ghost became a major phenomenon in the 1990s when Mike Lazo pitched the idea of making the character the host of an adult animated talk show titled Space Ghost Coast to Coast. Almost as if the character was trying to redeem itself in the public eye after many years, the concept became a major success with a multiple-season run that ended around 2008. Some interesting links actually brought the narrative of the talk show back to the original animated series through the idea of getting his villains, Zorak and Moltar, as they're forced to work on the show for their freedom. Zorak was placed behind the circular keyboard and became the Andy Richter to Space Ghost, or one could say he was more like the Jeff Peterson to the Craig Ferguson-esque Space Ghost. The show even managed to spawn some spin-offs, including The Brack Show and Aqua Teen Hunger Force. While the characters did receive a whole new life, an entire new generation witnessed him in a different format. The 1966 show is credited with giving rise to similar superhero-themed action-adventure shows that aired on other major networks during that period.
Criaturas aladas mais mortais.
Comic book life. While the rebirth of the series introduced a completely different tone and a fresh take on the character, the graphic novels adopted a distinct approach, highlighting some of the other aspects of the character that also required attention. Dan Spiegel adapted the series for a comic strip distributed by Gold Key Comics, and it was then that the character also appeared on the pages of Marvel Comics, Comico, and even Archie Comics. These adaptations actually provided insight into other aspects of the character, offering a closer look into the past and what made him the iconic rendition of an authority figure that inhabits outer space. By 2016, the character was incorporated into the Future Quest arc from DC Comics, playing a major role alongside Dino Boy. He even got to meet other Hanna-Barbera creations, including Johnny Quest, the Herculoids, Birdman, and the Galaxy Trio, and other similar designs. David Pepose, who recently brought Space Ghost to life in the pages of the Dynamite Entertainment comic books, hinted at the possibilities that could be explored with the character. According to him, I grew up in the 90s, so my initial exposure to Space Ghost was his tenure as a talk show host in Space Ghost Coast to Coast. But when I was in college and started my first internship in the comics industry, I naturally got into the history of the medium and its various characters, which is how I first learned about Alex Toth, the legendary designer of Space Ghost, and how the character was originally a superhero from the same era as Adam West's Batman. The more I learned about Toth and Space Ghost, the more I was blown away by the sheer number of incredible concepts that inhabited Space Ghost's world. Between his powers, his supporting cast, and his amazingly stacked bench of villains, Space Ghost is a character that's just as iconic of a superhero as Batman, Spider-Man, or The Flash. And that's something I'm excited to explore in this series. So yeah, the comic books division is one place where Space Ghost won't be ghosted anytime soon. By the way, the original series also paved the way for a manga adaptation, which ran in Weekly Shonen Sunday by Shogakukan in 1967. Launching Adult Swim. Would you believe us if we told you one of the biggest programming blocks that has birthed and continues to birth some of the greatest shows of all time holds Space Ghost responsible for its success? Well, get ready to face the facts, because the return of Space Ghost in that interview format actually spawned some of the adult-oriented shows that ended up being the primary lineup for the Adult Swim programming block. Eric Andre, who ended up hosting the absurd and bizarre The Eric Andre Show, mentioned that he was massively influenced by Space Ghost's interview format and stated, "Before we started shooting, I rented as many seasons as I could get my hands on and did a Space Ghost marathon by myself in my house just so I could absorb as much Space Ghost as I could. I picked Mike Lazo's brain about it. That's an executive at Adult Swim, and he's also the creator of Space Ghost. And he couldn't give a shit about Space Ghost. He's like, what? Space Ghost? Space Ghost is dead to me. Luckily for us, Space Ghost ain't really dead, and the character has had various revivals in various formats. And here's looking forward to a possible revival of his original run with a fresh new take that might just be what our space police and ex-talk show hosts need around now."
What do you think happened to her, Space Ghost?
The evil ones usually get away.
Yes.
Pop culture relevance. Although this deserves to be mentioned in the legacy of the series, the fact that Space Ghost made it into a Saturday Night Live sketch clearly sets it apart from the rest of these facts. Yup, Rob Schneider made a joke about the FCC's ruling that cartoons aren't real in the Weekend Update stating that Space Ghost worked according to the concept of educating kids, as it managed to teach him that ghosts are real. I mean, that's a really funny joke, especially for Rob Schneider. Good old SNL even brought Ghost Space in as material for their jokes.
Primeiro meu raio de calor.
Marvelous verdict! Saturday Night Live wasn't the only platform where Space Ghost was mentioned, as he also made it into a Fairly Odd episode of the Fairly Odd Parents TV movie, Channel Chasers. The character of Space Spectre appears as a parody of Space Ghost, and you know that the character is good when multiple cartoon shows seem to be making references and parodies. I mean, enough with the humiliation for a character that clearly appears to have a very dark arc. Maybe it's time that people saw him as the perfect pick for the next cinematic universe choice. Perhaps it's time for the Hanna-Barbera cinematic universe. There are enough characters to bring to the table, and while each one of them has a completely different theme and genre, it wouldn't be surprising to see them come together in crossover events. What do you think? Are you on team #Hanna-Barbera Cinematic Universe? As always, if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Otherwise, have a good one. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.